The dangers of plaster renovation when the walls are wet and salty. Have you come across such facades? Aren't they ugly? Plastered a few years ago and now again damaged. Despite breathable restoration plaster, the moisture is rising. The obviously incorrect renovation measure cost a great deal of money, dirt and annoyance. The state worsens from year to the next, as clearly demonstrated by the annual rings on these photographs.
Sie meinen, da sollte sich etwas verändern? Ja, es gibt eine Abhilfe. Man kann dagegen etwas tun.
In this film we will show you a few tips and golden rules that will make things clear and dispel darkness. Mr. Mohorn is also construction-orientated masonry diagnostician who has been performing research in this field from 1983 on and has developed a rapid measurement procedure for construction in order to work out the correct renovation techniques.
Schauen wir uns doch einmal naturwissenschaftliche Grundlagen an, die, wenn sie verstanden werden, Probleme in der Praxis effektiv lösen sollten. Den Stoff Salz, den kennen Sie ja.
Salt is able to strongly attract moisture from the air. This property is known as hygroscopic, from the Greek word hygros, which means moist, and scopein, which means to look. In a very dry indoor climate, salt trickles like fine sand. When the air becomes moisture, salt turns stickier. Rule number 1. Salt is very hygroscopic.
Wenn bei einem alten Mauerwerk die waagerechte Isolierung fehlt oder schadhaft ist, so steigt Feuchtigkeit auf und transportiert Salze mit.
Salts in the ground are derived from the waste products of microorganisms, fertilizers in the agriculture, road salts in winter, and of course from acid rain, i.e. atmospheric pollution. Most salts are deposited in the evaporation zone or on the outer layers on the wall, which is the plaster. Salt concentrations are highest behind paint or wallpaper.
Das ist der Grund, warum zum Beispiel eine Tapete oder der Anstrich bei hoher Luftfeuchtigkeit optisch feuchter erscheint.
And more dry in the heating period. Salt attracts humidity. Rule 2. The higher the salt concentration on the wall surface, the more dangerous it is.
Es gibt Salze mit unterschiedlichen feuchteziehenden Eigenschaften.
Different salts have different hygroscopic properties. Ground salts like nitrates or chlorides attract moisture more than salts contained in building materials, such as carbonates. The dangerousness of all harmful salts as well as their quantity can be determined directly and rapidly at the building site on the basis of their electrical conductivity. Time-consuming chemical analyses are not needed. Rule 3. The dangerousness of the total of the harming salts can be registered rapidly using measuring devices directly at the building.
Ist eine bestimmte Menge an Schadsalzen erreicht, so schreibt beispielsweise die ÖNORM vor, dass effektive Maßnahmen ergriffen werden müssen, was jedoch von der Bauwirtschaft viel zu wenig beachtet wird.
Rule 4. A critical pollution level due to harmful salts calls for additional measures. To put it simple, a building specialist is obliged to check the level of salt pollution in masonry before any renovation of plaster in order to initiate any measures that might be needed, such as a partial desalination. As practice has shown, many so-called building or renovation specialists omit these crucial examinations.
Nun kommen wir zum Putz. Die herkömmlichen Putze, wie zum Beispiel Kalkputz, Zementputz oder Kalkzementputz, lösen aus der Ziegeloberfläche Salze heraus und diese gelangen dann an die Oberfläche des neuen Putzes.
Rule 5. Conventional plasters are unsuitable for masonry with excessive quantities of salt.
Sogenannte Sanierputze haben eine tolle Eigenschaft. Sie haben durch die chemischen Zuschlagstoffe eine wasserabweisende Wirkung. Für den Spritzwasserbereich ist diese Eigenschaft sehr wertvoll.
A simple test, the Aquapol hydrophobia test, shows the water-repellent properties of the restoration plaster one has used. Distilled water, which is used for this purpose, is purified of salt and minerals and is not absorbed from the plaster. Here is a test with ordinary lime and cement plaster to make the difference clear. As you can see, the difference is enormous.
Sanierputze haben auch einen sehr großen Bohrenanteil.
About 25% of plaster volume must be air. Air pores provide the plaster with better thermal insulation properties than conventional plasters. Thanks to these very good properties, the open-port and water-repellent renovation plaster does not permit any masonry moisture to pass in liquid form, but only in the form of vapor, which is humidity. Hence, the plaster looks dry from the outside for a long time. But appearances are deceptive. The wall behind remains wet. Rule number 6. Renovation plaster alone, without drying out and without a horizontal moisture barrier, does not solve the problem. On the contrary, as building research as well as building practice have proven, moisture rises even higher and destroys the old plaster lying above.
Wie kann das passieren? Ganz einfach. Der ursprünglich offenporige Sanierputz wird durch die Salze verstopft, wird zum Sperrputz und somit steigt die Feuchtigkeit im Mauerwerk dann noch höher.
Rule number 7. Gradually, in the absence of drying out, a renovation render turns into a partly waterproof plaster.
Nun, wie schaut es mit der Mauerfeuchte aus? Wann sollte man idealerweise putzsanieren?
When should you ideally apply the new plaster? How long does it take for masonry to be dried out? Did you know that every moist masonry can absorb 400 to 500 liters of water per cubic meter? Try to make 1 liter of water evaporate on the stove. At the lowest setting, which would be the temperature of the sun, it would take several hours for moisture to evaporate fully. The sun will mainly absorb the uppermost layers.
Nun, wann sollte man bei den konventionellen Methoden mit der Putzsanierung beginnen? Die Normen sind hier eindeutig, nämlich nach der Trockenlegung des Mauerwerks.
Why? Very simple. When moisture is evaporating through masonry, dissolved salts are transported as well. This would move in the new plaster and destroy it from the inside by clogging it. This usually takes about 3 to 6 years.
Je nachdem, wie viel Feuchtigkeit ist und wie hoch der Feuchtespiegel im Mauerwerk ist.
Masonry moisture needs to evaporate completely through both sides of the wall. Rule number 8. Masonry should be dry before starting conventional plaster renovation. This is not the case when the Aquapol method is used. Only the upper part of masonry moisture evaporates. The much greater part moves downward into the porous capillary system of the wall. This reduces the drying out time by half. Dissolved salts come out in the upper evaporation soon, and the larger part moves back to the ground where it came from. The evaporation phase takes about 3 to 12 months. You should ideally wait for this length of time before starting renovation of plaster. Rule number 9. When using the Aquapol procedure, you should ideally wait for the evaporation phase of partial desalination, which takes about 3 to 12 months before renovating the plaster with a special technique. An old waterproof cement plaster should be removed as fast as possible. An open-pored lime cement plaster may be permitted to remain as a so-called victim plaster or a salt buffer in the masonry. It will absorb the salts, which are then removed together with the old plaster. Rule number 10. The less salts there are in masonry, the less is the residual moisture.
Auch wenn ein Mauerwerk schon teilweise trockengelegt wurde und erst anschließend putzsaniert werden sollte, gibt es einfach noch einen weiteren Faktor, den man beachten muss, nämlich der pH-Wert der Baustoffe.
The pH value of a material tells you whether the material is an acid or a base, also known as lye. Water, for instance, has mainly a neutral pH value of about 7.
Nun, Baustoffe haben unterschiedliche pH-Werte. Ein Ziegel zum Beispiel hat einen pH-Wert etwa zwischen 7 bis 8.
Cement-based plaster has a pH of 13 to 14, thus is highly alkaline.
Ist also daher stark basisch.
When materials of different pHs come together, as for instance brick or cement-based plaster, you will obtain a measurable electrochemical voltage between these materials.
Elektrochemische Spannung zwischen diesen beiden Baustoffen.
Rule number 11. Different moist materials connected with each other will generate electrochemical voltage.
Was bewirkt dieses Mini-Kraftwerk, diese Spannung bzw. dieser Batterieeffekt?
It attracts moisture or retains it artificially. According to common parlance, cement attracts moisture.
Mir wurde diese Aussage klar, nachdem ich das Ganze auf die pH-Wertunterschiede hin untersuchte.
Slightly moist walls create a positive pole in one material and a negative pole in the other, like a battery. The higher the pH differences between materials, the higher the voltage. Rule number 12. This electrochemical voltage attracts moisture and often keeps it in masonry.
Wie kann man diese so wichtigen Umstände umgehen? Wie kann man den Risiken der Salzen und der pH-Wertunterschiede ausweichen? Wie kann man Zeit einsparen? Können Sie jahrelang in unverputzte Räume wohnen? Haben Sie diese Zeit und stört Sie das nicht? Kann man das Mauerwerk auch rascher mit Putz verschließen, ohne dass es trocken ist? Gibt es da nicht eine schnellere, praktikablere Lösung? Eine Lösung mit natürlichen Rohstoffen und somit baubiologisch einwandfrei? Ja, es gibt sie.